Getting a movie produced in China that features divisive political themes is no walk in the park. Jiang Wen, an award winning Chinese director, was banned from making movies for 7 years because his World War II film, Devils on the Doorstep, was deemed insufficiently patriotic. One misstep and you can be Jack Ma'd into an early retirement. The Chinese government has been censoring film for nearly 100 years with varying degrees of severity, but no era of cinema would have made it easy to produce a movie about the rape of Nanking, one of the darkest events in Chinese history. But that is what Chuan was able to accomplish with his 2011 film, City of Life and Death. Before Chuan could even film his massive war story, it took 6 months to get the script approved by the Chinese censors. Principal photography itself took a staggering 253 days. For comparison, Saving Private Ryan was filmed in just over 60. He had to wait another 6 months to get the censors' final blessing, and even after all of that, the movie was prevented from being shown at Palm Springs Film Festival because a documentary about the Dalai Lama was also being shown at the event. If the same script was proposed today, it's highly unlikely that it would see the light of day. In 2018, the organization in charge of Chinese film censorship, the State Administration of Radio and TV, was formally absorbed by the Communist Party's publicity department, which tightened the party's grip on content produced by Chinese filmmakers. With that in mind, we should consider ourselves lucky that City of Life and Death was brought to life because it's one of the most unique war films ever created. There was major trepidation to tell the story from both parties involved because for the Chinese, it was a humiliating military defeat. In less than 2 weeks, their capital was conquered, and for the Japanese, in the aftermath of the battle, their soldiers committed some of the most hellish atrocities of the 20th century. The director knew that telling a universal story about the rape of Nanking was going to be a balancing act. He revealed in an interview that he was taught that all Japanese soldiers were beasts, but he wanted to touch the heart of every audience. He wanted to show how, quote, a common person becomes a killer, or how a person suffers in battle. Shockingly, Chuan was able to accomplish his objective. And his movie is not only worth appreciating from a filmmaking perspective, but also from a human perspective. He could have made a pure propaganda movie where every Japanese character is a murderous brute, and that would have been more socially acceptable in China. But he aimed for truth, and it's well worth analyzing the results. The first roughly half an hour of the film shows us the Japanese subduing Nanking, and we're introduced to the battle in a very intimate way. We begin with a sleeping Japanese soldier named Katakawa. The entire film is meant to feel like a dream. Many of the transitions are fades to black that make it seem like we're drifting in and out of consciousness, so it's fitting that Katakawa enters the war-torn reality by exiting a dream. And the very first thing he lays eyes on is the sun, the symbol of the Japanese Empire. The battle to take the city is exhilarating. The action is shot handheld, which makes us feel every shot an explosion. The set on which the battle was filmed took months to create because the director wanted to operate with total freedom. The characters are actually moving through a war zone. They can interact with the environment in a totally immersive way, and that makes the firefights feel distinct from other movies. A clear divide is revealed early on. When the Japanese are engaged with the Chinese soldiers, they're organized and efficient. They've won many battles, they know what to expect from the men in their unit, but when they come into contact with hundreds of unarmed Chinese civilians, they don't know what to do. And this shot, by the way, is absolutely stunning. The Japanese know how to flush out enemy combatants, but emptying out the church is another matter. It's chaotic and messy. People die that don't need to because the invaders treat every sound and movement like it could be the enemy executing an ambush. But contrary to expectations, Katakawa's response to the first civilian killing is not stone-faced and empty. He feels the impact of the deaths and can't stop staring at the bodies. Chuan said that many Chinese viewers were not pleased by Katakawa's sympathetic portrayal in the story, which is set up in this early scene. The end of the battle shows us the bravery of the Chinese soldiers who decided not to wave the white flag, and it's a community resistance. Even the children have ammo belts draped around their necks. And what I love about the action, and this is a constant throughout the entire movie, is how personal it feels. We get the fast-paced exchanges, the bullets whizzing through the air, the buildings crumbling under tank fire, but we also get a ton of close-ups. There are probably more close-ups per minute in City and Life and Death than any other war movie I've ever watched. And this goes a long way in making the audience feel the human cost of the battle. After seeing the eyes and the expressions of these characters, you feel the impact of their deaths. They're not reduced to mere cannon fodder. The mass executions are painful to watch, but the movie does not inflate numbers. The Japanese really did machine gun thousands at a time, and that was probably the best way to go given the other options on the table. There are countless memorable images during this 10 minutes of mass murder, most of which happen in silence. The only words spoken are commands by the Japanese. The Chinese victims communicate with glances and glares. And that's all that's needed to draw emotion. The looks exchanged between the Chinese warrior and the little boy stand out for their potency. From the Japanese side, the most striking moment is not when they're doing the killing, it's when they're burying the dead. They huddle into a little group and pat down the dirt with their boots. It looks like something you'd see children doing on a playground or something, but then you see the heads. It's a very strange scene, a genius scene, especially because it follows explosions and machine gun fire. The sound of tiny steps are comparatively innocent. It doesn't align with how horrific the activity truly is. They're practically doing a little dance on a mass grave, but their minds are completely numb to it. When all of this killing is completed, we get to see the Japanese with their guns put away. And we don't find brutes who spend every waking moment plotting their next atrocity. Their behavior is marked by playfulness. They poke fun at each other, they pull pranks. They aren't all that different from other men their age when they're only among each other. It's when they venture into Chinese areas that their capacity for evil is put into action. What's interesting about the evil we see from the Japanese in City of Life and Death is how casual it is. When they go around the city terrorizing people, they treat it like a game. They don't bask in the evil of it, they're not like Emperor Palpatine getting high on hatred and anger. When they see women they want to rape, they have fun tricking them into their clutches. There's an underlying assumption that Chinese women are items to be used at their leisure. The film doesn't fully explore where this assumption comes from, but a Japanese soldier who is actually at Nanking does offer an explanation in his confessional book, The Diary of Azuma Shiro. We had fun killing Chinese. We caught some Chinese civilians, we either buried them alive or pushed them into a fire, or beat them to death with clubs. When they were half dead, we pushed them into ditches and burned them, torturing them to death. Everyone gets his entertainment this way. It's like killing dogs and cats. We were taught that we were a superior race, since we lived only for the sake of a human god, our emperor. But the Chinese were not, so we held nothing but contempt for them. In many iconic war films, we are constantly presented with the theme of man battling his primordial instincts, and no movie explores it better than Apocalypse Now. In Kurtz's famous monologue, he explains how the perfect soldier is one that's capable of embracing brutality while in battle, but able to recognize and value human life when it's over. That is not an easy balance to strike, obviously. It may not even be fully possible, but that's the ideal Kurtz imagined. So keeping the capacity to empathize is difficult enough after watching your friends be ripped to pieces in battle. When you add on top of that a culture and upbringing that offers no moral rationale for having empathy for the defeated population, the thin crust above the volcano crumbles. The Japanese were not the only army to be influenced by this deadly combination in the 20th century. Another representative actually plays a part in the film. There's a Nazi ambassador in Nanking when it falls, and he's actually a force for good in the story. It's probably the only movie you'll ever see where the Nazi is a compassionate presence, but in only a few years his party will be replicating the cruelty. The point being, no nation is ever safe from being possessed by this dynamic. In the film's most unforgettable scene, there's a hypnotic dance sequence that shows how difficult it would be for one of these soldiers to separate themselves from the tribe. The routine itself is extremely captivating because it goes to the beat of these massive drums, but the hand movements have a lightness to them. There's a unique mix of power and elegance. These men are part of a proud country, an empire. They've been unified since birth by the idea that their empire stands above the rest of the world. This dance is the perfect representation of that unification, and it's not something that can be simply broken by a moral inclination. There is one Japanese soldier that feels a deep urge to be different. He even treats a Japanese prostitute sent to his regiment as a human being, which she doesn't understand. His attempts to distance himself from the needless violence are unsuccessful, but there is no peaceful way to step out of the dance. The environmental pressures go to war with his conscience, and neither side can gain the advantage. So the collision ends in suicide. Kadakawa's final words are, "It's harder to live than to die." The Japanese side of the film is fascinating and shows the casual spirit of the atrocities very effectively, but it's the behavior of the Chinese citizens being persecuted that elevates City of Life and Death to greatness. The people all understand that a walk across the street could end in their torture and death, so they do what they can to avoid being picked out. The women cut their hair, and some of the men try to cut deals with the Japanese. One man who attempts to bargain is Mr. Tang, a family man who works for the Nazi ambassador, and becomes a target of fraudulent safety assurances. Those who try to avoid Japanese brutality quickly find out that they're playing a losing game. The paper of friendship given to Mr. Tang is ignored, and they murder one of his children. And the women are eventually herded into a church so that 100 can be picked out as designated sex slaves. Despite landing in an impossible situation, some citizens decide to stand up and willingly take on unimaginable suffering so that others can avoid it. Women in the church, facing endless rape and likely death, begin volunteering for slavery. It's one of the most powerful moments of the film, and for the Imperial Japanese Army that values bravery as much as anything, it's one hell of a sight to behold. Mr. Tang displays similar bravery when the Nazi ambassador is called home and the Japanese allow him to take 2 of his workers along. Mr. Tang has the option to escape the massacre with his wife, but instead decides to sacrifice his life so one of the other assistants can be set free. He knows he's destined for a firing squad, but in his final moments with his wife, he has a little smile on his face. It's an incredible scene. Just before the Japanese put him in line, the smile is still there, and he tells them why. His wife is pregnant again. His family will live on despite what's about to happen to him. The firing squad sequence concludes with this amazing shot. Mr. Tang is dead, but the man who puts him to death is left empty and confused. It would be impossible to judge the women who didn't raise their hands, and it'd be impossible to judge Mr. Tang if he decided to leave with his wife. In fact, I think it'd be immoral to do so in both cases. But choosing to sacrifice yourself in that way is the height of heroism. It might even be the height of human experience. When we look at human history, what follows major battles is usually light in detail. It's typically just, so-and-so civilization captured the city, and then ravaged its inhabitants. What goes in the history books is simply who won and who lost. City of Life and Death is centered around one civilization capturing the capital of its main geographic rival, but the Japanese conquest does not feel significant. What truly feels significant is the individual sacrifices made by Chinese citizens. That is what echoes in eternity. History books may not highlight these hidden lives, but I'd like to think that courage and humility of that magnitude is rewarded on the other side, hopefully. City of Life and Death is a superb story about a subject few filmmakers would have the guts to approach. Chuan was able to show the tragedy that was the rape of Nanking in a nuanced way that didn't portray the Japanese as pure evil monsters, but rather men who were given a mandate by their culture to indulge their most destructive instincts. But ultimately, City of Life and Death is about how the goodness of mankind can shine through the darkest fog of hell. It's similar to Schindler's List in how it makes that message known. The movie might be a tier below Spielberg's masterpiece, but for a movie that passed through Communist Party censors, it's a remarkable achievement. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe on your way out. And if you've seen City of Life and Death, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section. Was there one moment that deeply impacted you, or a scene that maybe didn't work so well? I'd be curious to see other opinions. But thank you so much, guys, for stopping by. I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe and have a fantastic rest of your day. I will talk to you soon.